The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's pub like bullets on metal. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of conversations between strangers seeking shelter from both the storm and their own demons. Jake Morrison sat at the far end of the mahogany bar, nursing his third whiskey of the evening. His broad shoulders hunched forward, creating a barrier between himself and the world behind him. The bartender moved with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid and precise as she cleaned glasses and served drinks. Jake had been watching her for the past hour, not in a creepy way, but with the trained eye of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. There was something about the way she carried herself, the perfect posture, the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, the subtle tension in her muscles that never quite relaxed. It reminded him of his own team members back in the day. She was tall, maybe 5'8", with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her green eyes held secrets, and there was a small scar above her left eyebrow that suggested she had seen action somewhere sometime. When she smiled at customers, it was professional but never quite reached her eyes. Jake recognized that look. It was the same one he saw in the mirror every morning. The pub was filled with the usual Friday night crowd. Construction workers unwinding after a long week, office employees drowning their sorrows, and a few college students trying to look older than they were. But the woman behind the bar stood out like a diamond among glass shards. Her name tag read Sarah, but Jake suspected that wasn't her real name, or at least not the only name she had gone by. As the evening progressed, Jake found himself drawn into conversation with the regulars around him. Old Tom, a Vietnam veteran with hands that shook from too many battles and too much bourbon, told stories that everyone had heard a dozen times before. Maria, a nurse from the local hospital, shared gossip about doctors and administrators with anyone who would listen. But through it all, Jake kept one eye on Sarah, studying her movements and mannerisms. When a drunk customer got too handsy with one of the waitresses, Sarah was there in seconds. She didn't make a scene or call for security. She simply appeared beside the man, whispered something in his ear, and he immediately backed away, looking pale and apologetic. The way she handled the situation was textbook de-escalation, the kind they taught in military training. No civilian bartender learned moves like that from a hospitality course. Around midnight, as the crowd began to thin out, Jake made his decision. He had been debating with himself for hours, but the whiskey and his curiosity finally won out. He walked over to where Sarah was wiping down the bar, her movements automatic and efficient even after what must have been a long shift. "Excuse me," Jake said, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of shouting orders over gunfire and helicopter rotors. Sarah looked up, her green eyes meeting his blue ones with a directness that confirmed his suspicions. This was definitely someone with military training. "Another whiskey?" she asked, already reaching for the bottle without waiting for his answer. Her voice was smooth but had an edge to it, like a blade wrapped in silk. "Actually, I was wondering something," Jake said, leaning against the bar but keeping his distance, close enough to talk, far enough to show respect. "I've been sitting here watching you work, and I can't shake the feeling that we might have something in common." Sarah's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she poured his drink, but it was enough for Jake to notice. "Oh, and what might that be?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Jake took a sip of his whiskey, savoring the burn as he chose his words carefully. "The way you move, the way you handled that situation earlier, the way your eyes never stop scanning the room, it all seems familiar. I'm guessing you weren't always a bartender." A small smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth, and for the first time that evening it seemed genuine. "You're very observant," she said, setting the bottle down with deliberate precision. "What gave it away?" 20 years in the Navy will teach you to recognize your own kind," Jake replied, watching her face for any reaction. "I'm guessing you served too." "What branch?" Sarah's expression shifted slightly, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the soldier beneath. She glanced around the bar, noting that only a handful of customers remained, all too absorbed in their own conversations or drinks to pay attention to theirs. The last call had been announced 30 minutes ago, and most people were either settling their tabs or making plans to head home. "Air Force," she said finally, her voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate vicinity. "Though I spend most of my time attached to joint operations." "You said Navy? Let me guess. Not just any sailor?" "You've got that look about you." Jake nodded, recognizing the careful way she was sharing information. It was the same dance they all did when meeting someone new who might understand their world. Give a little, see what you get back, always ready to shut down the conversation if it went too far. "Special operations," he confirmed, then decided to take a leap of faith. "SEAL Team 6, actually. Spent 15 years jumping out of perfectly good aircraft and swimming in places that weren't on any tourist maps." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, and Jake could see her reassessing him. "SEAL Team 6 wasn't something you mentioned lightly. It was the elite of the elite, the unit that handled the missions that never made it into the newspapers." The fact that he had told her meant either he was lying, which she doubted given everything else about him, or he was being remarkably open about his background. "That explains the shoulders," she said with a slight grin, nodding toward his broad frame. "And the way you've been sitting there all evening like you're expecting trouble to walk through that door at any moment." Jake chuckled, some of the tension leaving his posture for the first time that evening. "Old habits. You never really stop scanning for threats, do you? Even in a place like this." "Especially in a place like this," Sarah agreed, her eyes doing another sweep of the room even as they talked. "Alcohol makes people unpredictable, and unpredictable people are dangerous people." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two warriors recognizing each other in civilian clothing. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and the overhead lights cast long shadows across the nearly empty bar. Jake found himself studying Sarah's face more closely now that her guard was partially down. The scar above her eyebrow was definitely from something sharp, shrapnel, maybe, or a piece of debris from an explosion. "So what brings a Navy SEAL to a dive bar in downtown Portland on a Friday night?" Sarah asked, beginning to stack clean glasses behind the bar. "Don't tell me you're here for the atmosphere." Jake laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "Honestly? I was supposed to meet an old teammate here, but he canceled at the last minute. Something about his wife going into labor 3 weeks early. I figured I was already here, might as well have a drink. And stayed for 3 hours because I recognized a fellow veteran when I saw one, and those are getting harder to find in civilian life," Jake admitted. "Most people don't understand what it's like to come back from that world and try to fit into this one. They see the uniform in old photos and think they know your story, but they have no idea what it really means." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant. "The transition is harder than any mission they ever sent us on. At least in the field, you knew who the enemy was and what the objectives were. Out here, everyone's supposed to be friendly, but half the time, you can't tell who's telling the truth and who's just trying to sell you something." "Exactly," Jake said, feeling a connection that he hadn't experienced in months. "So what's your story? How does an Air Force veteran end up slinging drinks in Portland?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to share. Jake could see the internal debate playing out across her features, the desire to connect with someone who understood, warring with the ingrained secrecy that had kept her alive in whatever operations she had been involved in. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Let's just say that my last mission didn't end the way anyone planned, and when the dust settled, civilian life seemed like the safest option for everyone involved." Jake recognized the carefully neutral language of someone who had been through debriefings and psychological evaluations, someone who had learned to talk around the truth without lying outright. He also recognized the pain behind her words, the kind that came from losing people you cared about or making decisions that haunted your dreams. "I'm sorry," he said simply, because sometimes that was all you could say to a fellow warrior who had seen too much and lost too much. "Thanks," Sarah replied, and Jake could hear the genuine gratitude in her voice. Not many people understand that sometimes sorry is enough. The bar had grown quieter as the last few customers paid their tabs and headed out into the stormy night. Sarah began her closing routine, moving with the same efficient precision that had marked everything else she did that evening. Jake finished his whiskey and prepared to leave, but found himself reluctant to end the conversation. "Can I ask you one more question?" he said as Sarah came back to his section of the bar. "Shoot." Jake hesitated for a moment, then decided to go with his instincts. "What was your call sign?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a recently fired gun. Sarah's hand froze halfway to the glass she had been reaching for, and Jake saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of just how personal the question was. Call signs weren't just nicknames in the military world. They were badges of honor, markers of identity that told stories about who you were and what you had accomplished. Sarah straightened slowly, her green eyes meeting Jake's with an intensity that hadn't been there before. For a moment, Jake wondered if he had pushed too far, crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed between two strangers sharing war stories in a bar. But then Sarah's expression softened slightly, and he realized she was making the same calculation he had been making all evening: how much trust to extend, how much of herself to reveal. "That's a very personal question," she said quietly, but there was no anger in her voice. If anything, there was a note of respect, as if she appreciated that he understood the significance of what he was asking. "I know," Jake replied. "And you don't have to answer if you don't want to. There's something about you that seems familiar, and I can't shake the feeling that maybe our paths have crossed before, even if we've never met." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, those green eyes seeming to look right through him. Jake had the uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated by someone who was very good at reading people, someone who could probably tell him things about himself that he didn't even know. "Ghost 9, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the secure phone that was clipped to his belt, a habit that had never died even years after leaving active duty. Ghost 9. He knew that call sign, had heard it whispered in briefing rooms and seen it on classified reports that only a handful of people in the world had clearance to read. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, his mind racing through the implications. Ghost 9 wasn't just any Air Force pilot or support personnel. Ghost 9 was a legend, a ghost story that people in the special operations community told in hushed voices when they thought no one else was listening. Ghost 9 was the pilot who could get in anywhere and get out of places that shouldn't have been survivable. Ghost 9 was the reason some of the most dangerous missions of the last decade had succeeded when everyone expected them to. Fail. Sarah watched Jake's reaction with the calm detachment of someone who was used to having this effect on people. "I take it you've heard the name before," she said, and there was a slight edge to her voice now, the professional wariness of someone who had just revealed more than she had intended to. Jake's hand was still hovering near his communications device. Muscle memory and training, warring with the rational part of his brain that knew he wasn't on a mission and didn't need to call for backup or extraction. But Ghost 9 was supposed to be dead. Ghost 9 had been killed in action 3 years ago, during a classified operation that had gone sideways in the mountains of Afghanistan. Jake had been in the briefing room when they announced her death, had seen the closed casket funeral with full military honors. "You're supposed to be dead?" Jake said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. "Yeah, well, sometimes being dead is the safest place to be, especially when there are people who would prefer you stay that way." The implications of what she was saying began to sink in. If Ghost 9 was alive, if she had faked her own death and was now working as a bartender in Portland under an assumed name, then something had gone very wrong with that last mission. Something bad enough that the military had been willing to let one of their most valuable assets disappear, rather than risk whatever consequences might come from keeping her alive and active. Jake's mind was spinning, trying to process the enormity of what he had just learned. Ghost 9 had been involved in some of the most sensitive operations of the War on Terror. She had extracted high-value targets from locations that were supposed to be impenetrable. She had provided air support for missions that officially never happened. If she was in hiding, if she felt the need to maintain a false identity even 3 years after her supposed death, then there were implications that reached far beyond anything Jake had imagined when he walked into this bar. "How many people know?" Jake asked, his voice automatically dropping to the same whisper level that Sarah had used. "Know that I'm alive?" "Maybe 5 people in the world." "Know where I am?" "You just became number 2. The weight of that trust wasn't lost on Jake. Ghost 9, Sarah, had just entrusted him with information that could get her killed if it fell into the wrong hands. It was the kind of trust that you only extended to someone you believed would rather die than betray you. The kind of trust that was forged in combat and tempered by a shared understanding of what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. "Why?" Jake asked. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands moving automatically as she continued her closing routine. The bar was empty now except for the 2 of them, and the storm outside seemed to be intensifying, the rain hammering against the windows with renewed fury. "Because," she said finally, "I think you might be the first person I've met since I've been here who would understand why I made the choice I made. And because—" She paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. "Because I have a feeling that my past might be about to catch up with me, and if it does, I'm going to need someone I can trust." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "What do you mean?" Sarah reached under the bar and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled many times. She set it on the bar between them, her finger resting on the edge as if she was still deciding whether to open it. "This came in the mail yesterday," she said. "No return address, postmarked from 3 different cities. Inside is a single photograph." Sarah opened the envelope with steady hands, though Jake could see the tension in her shoulders as she carefully extracted a single photograph. She placed it face down on the bar between them, her finger still resting on the back as if touching it could somehow change what was printed on the other side. "Before I show you this," Sarah said, her voice taking on the flat, professional tone that soldiers used when discussing dangerous situations, "I need you to understand something. The mission that supposedly killed Ghost 9 was off the books. Way off the books. The kind of operation that gets people disappeared if they ask too many questions about it." Jake nodded, recognizing the weight of what she was telling him. He had been on enough classified missions to understand how the game was played at the highest levels. Sometimes the mission was so sensitive that it was better to lose good people than to risk the political fallout if things went wrong. The target was a compound in the mountains outside Kandahar. Sarah continued, her eyes distant as she recalled details she had probably spent 3 years trying to forget. Intelligence said it was a high-value target, someone who could provide information about planned attacks on American soil. My job was to provide air support for a ground team that was going in to extract him. Jake could picture it, the kind of night. Mission where everything had to go perfectly because there was no backup plan and no official support if things went sideways. The kind of mission where pilots like Ghost 9 earned their legendary status by doing the impossible under impossible conditions. But when the ground team got there, the intelligence was wrong. It wasn't a terrorist safe house. It was a refugee camp. Families, children, old people who had been displaced by fighting and were just trying to survive. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes. The ground team leader called for extraction, but by then we had been spotted by enemy forces in the area. They were using the camp as a shield, firing on us from positions that would have required us to return fire into the civilian population. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had been in similar situations, where the line between completing the mission and preserving innocent life became impossibly blurred. It was the kind of decision that haunted soldiers for the rest of their lives, regardless of what choice they made. The ground team was pinned down, taking heavy casualties. Command was screaming for me to provide close air support, to take out the enemy positions regardless of collateral damage. They said the mission was too important to abort, that we couldn't let the target escape even if it meant— Sarah's voice trailed off. But Jake could fill in the blanks. "But you didn't," Jake said, understanding beginning to dawn on him. You refused the order. Sarah nodded slowly. I couldn't do it. I couldn't fire on a position that I knew had children in it. So I came up with another plan. I told the ground team to mark their position with strobes, then I brought my aircraft in low and fast, using the rotor wash to create a dust storm that would provide cover for their extraction, while making it impossible for the enemy to get accurate fire on us. It was a brilliant tactical solution, the kind of innovative thinking that separated good pilots from legendary ones. But Jake could already sense that the story didn't have a happy ending. It worked. I got the ground team out without a single civilian casualty, but in the process my aircraft took heavy fire. I managed to get it back to base, but barely. The damage was extensive enough that any reasonable person would have concluded that the pilot didn't survive the crash landing. So you let them think you were dead. Jake said, It wasn't entirely my choice, Sarah replied. When the after-action reports were filed, certain people in the chain of command were not happy about how the mission had been resolved. There was talk about court-martials, about making examples of people who put civilian lives ahead of military objectives. My commanding officer came to me with a choice: face charges for disobeying direct orders, or accept a quiet transfer to a desk job where I would never fly again. Jake could see where this was heading. For someone like Ghost 9, a pilot who lived to fly, being grounded would have been a fate worse than death. But there was more to the story. There had to be, or she wouldn't be hiding in Portland 3 years later. I chose option 3, Sarah said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I died in a training accident 2 weeks later. Mechanical failure, no survivors, very tragic. Of course, the pilot who died wasn't actually me. It was a homeless veteran with no family who had overdosed on the streets of Kabul. We were about the same height and build, and after an explosion and fire, dental records can be inconclusive. The casual way she described faking her own death sent a chill down Jake's spine. It spoke to a level of planning and resources that could only come from very high up the chain of command. Someone with serious pull had helped Ghost 9 disappear, which meant that someone equally powerful had probably wanted her gone. Who helped you? Jake asked. Someone who believed that good soldiers shouldn't be punished for making the right choice, Sarah replied. Someone who understood that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is disobey orders. Sarah finally flipped over the photograph, and Jake felt his blood run cold. It showed Sarah behind the bar of Murphy's pub, clearly taken from across the street through the front windows. She was serving drinks to customers, her face clearly visible and unmistakably recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. But it wasn't just the fact that someone had found her that made Jake's heart race. It was the time stamp in the corner of the photograph. Yesterday, just hours before she had received it in the mail. Someone wasn't just watching Sarah, they were letting her know they were watching her. Any idea who sent it? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I have some theories, Sarah said grimly. The people who wanted me court-martialed 3 years ago didn't just disappear when I did. Some of them probably got promoted. And some of them probably never forgot about the pilot who embarrassed them by choosing human decency over following orders. Jake stared at the photograph, his mind racing through the implications. If Sarah's enemies had found her, then her carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down. And if they were bold enough to send her a surveillance photo, then they were probably planning something more dramatic than just exposing her identity. You can't stay here, Jake said, stating the obvious. If they know where you are, if they're watching you, then it's only a matter of time before they make their move. I know, Sarah replied, tucking the photograph back into the envelope. The question is, where do I go? And how do I get there without leading them straight to wherever I end up? Jake looked at this woman who had once been one of the military's most valuable assets, who had sacrificed everything to save innocent lives, and made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. You don't run, he said, reaching for his secure communications device. We fight. Jake's fingers moved with practiced precision across the secure device's keypad, entering a series of codes that would route his message through multiple encrypted channels before reaching its destination. Sarah watched him work, recognizing the calm efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before in situations where lives depended on getting the message through. "Who are you calling?" she asked, though she kept her voice low and continued her closing routine to maintain the appearance of normalcy in case they were being watched. "Someone who owes me a favor," Jake replied without looking up from the device. "And someone who has the resources to help us figure out exactly who's hunting you, and why they've decided to surface now after 3 years of silence." The device chirped softly, indicating that the encrypted channel had been established. Jake typed rapidly, sending a brief message that would look like random characters to anyone who intercepted it, but would convey everything his contact needed to know about the situation. Sarah had been found, her cover was blown, and they needed immediate assistance. While they waited for a response, Jake studied the photograph again, looking for any details that might provide clues about who had taken it. The angle suggested it had been shot from a vehicle parked across the street, probably with a telephoto lens. The quality was professional grade, not something taken with a phone camera or amateur equipment. Whoever was watching Sarah had serious resources and training. "Tell me about the people who wanted you court-martialed," Jake said, keeping his voice conversational in case anyone was listening. "What kind of positions did they hold? What kind of access would they have had to operational intelligence?" Sarah finished wiping down the last section of bar and began counting the cash register, her movements automatic while her mind focused on Jake's questions. The mission commander was a colonel named Marcus Webb. He was the one who gave the order to fire on the camp regardless of civilian casualties. When I refused, he accused me of cowardice and insubordination. Jake recognized the name immediately. Marcus Webb had been promoted to Brigadier General 2 years ago and was currently serving as Deputy Director of Special Operations Command. If Webb was involved in hunting Sarah, then she was facing an enemy with significant resources and institutional backing. "Webb's dangerous," Jake said quietly. "He's got the kind of position where he can make people disappear without anyone asking uncomfortable questions. If he's decided that you're a threat that needs to be eliminated, then we're not just dealing with personal vendetta, we're dealing with someone who thinks you have information that could damage him professionally or politically." Sarah's hands paused in their counting. "What kind of information?" "Think about it," Jake said, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place in his mind. "You were involved in a classified operation that went wrong. You refused illegal orders to fire on civilians. You witnessed war crimes that were covered up at the highest levels of command. If you ever decided to go public with what you know, the implication hung between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah wasn't just a former pilot trying to live quietly in civilian life. She was a walking threat to some very powerful people who had built their careers on making the kinds of decisions that looked good in briefing rooms but fell apart under moral scrutiny. Jake's device chirped again, indicating an incoming message. He read it quickly, then looked up at Sarah with an expression that was equal parts relief and concern. "Good news and bad news," he said. "The good news is that my contact confirms what we suspected, General. Webb has been using military intelligence resources to track down loose ends from operations that happened during his command. You're not the only one he's been hunting. And the bad news? The bad news is that this isn't just about covering up past mistakes. Webb is being considered for promotion to a position that would give him oversight of all special operations activities. If any of his past decisions came to light during the confirmation process, it would destroy his career and potentially expose a network of officers who have been covering for each other for years." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She had thought her disappearance 3 years ago had ended the matter, that by staying dead she had removed herself from whatever political games were being played at the Pentagon. But she was beginning to realize that her very existence was a threat that Webb couldn't tolerate, regardless of how quietly she lived her life. "So what's the plan?" she asked, recognizing that running wasn't really an option anymore. Even if she could disappear again, Webb would keep hunting her. And eventually his resources would give him an advantage that she couldn't overcome alone. Jake was typing another message when the lights in the bar suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, but the brief blackout was enough to send both of them into high alert mode. Jake's hand moved instinctively to where his sidearm would have been if he had been carrying one, while Sarah ducked behind the bar and reached for something that Jake couldn't see but suspected was a weapon of some kind. "That wasn't a power outage," Sarah said quietly. "The emergency generator kicked in too quickly and the backup lights are on a separate circuit. Someone cut the main power deliberately." Jake moved to the window, staying low and approaching from an angle that wouldn't silhouette him against the emergency lighting. The street outside looked normal. No obvious surveillance vehicles, no movement in the shadows. But his instincts were screaming that they were no longer alone. "Back exit?" he asked. "Through the kitchen, but it opens into an alley with only one way out. If they're professional, they'll have someone covering it." Jake's device chirped with another incoming message. He read it quickly, then cursed under his breath. "My contact says Webb's people have been tracking my communications. They know I'm here, and they know I've made contact with you." The implications were clear. Whatever window of opportunity they had to escape or prepare a defense was closing rapidly. Webb's people had found them, isolated them, and were probably moving into position for whatever came next. "How many people do you think he sent?" Sarah asked, checking the weapon she had retrieved from behind the bar, a compact pistol that looked like it had been well maintained and recently cleaned. "For Ghost 9? Probably a full tactical team. Webb knows your reputation, and he won't take any chances." Sarah smiled grimly. "Good, I was getting tired of pouring drinks anyway." Jake looked at this woman who had once been a legend in the special operations community, who had sacrificed everything to save innocent lives, and who was now facing the ultimate consequence of choosing principle over politics. She wasn't running, wasn't panicking, wasn't asking why this was happening to her. She was preparing to fight, just like the warrior she had always been. "You know, this is probably a one-way trip, right?" Jake said. "Even if we survive whatever's coming through that door, Webb won't stop hunting us. We'll be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives." Sarah checked her weapon one more time, then looked at Jake with eyes that held no fear, only determination. "Then we better make sure it's worth it." The first sign of movement came from the alley behind the kitchen. Sarah caught it through the small window above the industrial sink, a shadow that moved too, deliberately to be a stray cat or drunk wandering through the narrow passage. She held up 2 fingers to Jake, then pointed toward the back of the building. 2 contacts, rear approach. Jake nodded and moved to cover the front entrance, using the bar itself as concealment while keeping sight lines on both the main door and the large front windows. His secure device was still active, and he quickly sent what might be his final message to his contact. "Under attack, Murphy's Pub, Portland. Webb's people. Tell the world what happened here." The response came back almost immediately. "Help coming. Hold position." But Jake knew that help, if it was coming at all, wouldn't arrive in time to affect the outcome of the next few minutes. Whatever happened in this bar would be decided by 2 veterans with limited ammunition against a professional tactical team with superior numbers and equipment. Sarah moved through the darkened bar with the fluid precision of someone who had navigated hostile territory in much worse conditions. She positioned herself where she could cover both the kitchen entrance and provide Jake with overlapping fields of fire if the assault came from multiple directions. Simultaneously, the silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then Jake's device vibrated with an incoming call, not a text message, but an actual voice call on the secure channel. He answered it without speaking, listening to the voice on the other end. "Morrison, this is Colonel Sarah Chun, Military Intelligence. I need you to listen very carefully because we don't have much time. General Webb's operation tonight is unauthorized and unsanctioned. We've been building a case against him for months, and your contact with Ghost 9 has given us the evidence we need to move against him." Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. If Chin was telling the truth, then tonight's assault wasn't an official military operation, it was web acting. On his own to eliminate a threat to his career and freedom, the team outside. The bar consists of 4 former military contractors who have been working for Web off the books, Chun continued. They're armed and dangerous, but they're not operating under any legal authority. If you can hold them off for another 10 minutes, we'll have FBI tactical teams in position to arrest them. Sarah had moved close enough to hear Chun's voice, and Jake could see the calculation in her eyes. 10 minutes was an eternity in a firefight, especially when outnumbered and outgunned. But it was also their chance to finally turn the tables on the people who had been hunting her for 3 years. The front door of the bar exploded inward as a shaped charge detonated, sending wood splinters and glass across the interior. Jake had expected it and was already moving, using the bar as cover while returning fire at the figures silhouetted in the doorway. His shots were accurate and deliberate, forcing the assault team to take cover instead of rushing straight into the building. Simultaneously, the kitchen door burst open as the rear team made their entry. Sarah was ready for them, her compact pistol speaking with deadly accuracy in the confined space. The first contractor through the door dropped immediately, while the second dove behind an industrial refrigerator, his return fire chipping concrete from the walls above Sarah's head. 2 down, 2 still active, Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the ringing in their ears from the gunfire in the enclosed space. Jake was engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the remaining front team member, who had made it inside the bar and was using the overturned tables and chairs as concealment. The emergency lighting created confusing shadows that made accurate shooting difficult for both of them. Chun, where's our backup? Jake spoke into his device between exchanges of gunfire. 3 minutes out. FBI is surrounding the building now, but they need to be careful not to hit you in the crossfire. The contractor in the kitchen made a desperate rush toward Sarah's position, firing rapidly to suppress her while he closed the distance. But Sarah had been expecting the move. She rolled sideways, came up in a new position, and put 2 rounds center mass into her attacker before he could adjust his aim. Kitchen clear, she announced, then began moving toward the front to assist. Jake, the remaining contractor, seemed to realize that his position was becoming untenable. Jake could hear him speaking rapidly into a radio, probably calling for extraction or additional support. But instead of continuing the fight or attempting to withdraw, the man made a choice that sent ice through Jake's veins. He's going for explosives, Jake shouted as he saw the contractor reach for something attached to his tactical vest. If Webb's people had brought demolition charges, they were prepared to destroy the entire building rather than let Sarah escape again. Sarah moved faster than Jake would have thought possible, vaulting over the bar and tackling the contractor just as he was pulling the pin from what looked like a white phosphorus grenade. The 2 of them went down hard, fighting desperately for control of the deadly device. Jake couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting Sarah, so he holstered his weapon and dove into the struggle. The 3 of them rolled across the floor, the grenade bouncing away into the shadows while they fought with the brutal efficiency of people who knew that losing meant death. The contractor was younger and stronger than either of them. But Jake and Sarah had something he lacked. They were fighting for each other as much as themselves. When the man tried to break free and reach for his rifle, Sarah trapped his arm while Jake delivered a precise strike to his throat that ended the fight permanently. They were still catching their breath when the bar filled with the red laser dots of targeting systems and amplified voices shouting FBI. Everyone on the ground. Jake and Sarah raised their hands slowly, keeping their movements deliberate and non-threatening as federal agents swarmed into the building. Colonel Chien's voice crackled through Jake's device. Agent Rodriguez will ask for verification code Tango 77. Give him my direct number and tell him the ghost is flying again. 20 minutes later, Jake and Sarah sat in the back of an FBI command vehicle, warming their hands around cups of coffee that tasted better than anything either of them had consumed in years. Through the reinforced windows, they could see General Webb being led away in handcuffs, his career and freedom forfeit to the same corruption that had nearly destroyed Sarah's life 3 years earlier. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, watching as crime scene investigators photographed the bodies of Webb's contractors. "Colonel." Chen looked up from the tablet where she had been reviewing preliminary reports. Now you get to choose? Sarah Martinez, bartender, can disappear forever, and you can return to active duty with full honors and back pay? Or you can testify at Webb's trial and help us make sure this never happens to anyone else." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her options. She could return to the sky, return to the life she had loved before politics and corruption had destroyed everything. Or she could stand up in open court and tell the truth about what had happened in that refugee camp, knowing that it would make her a permanent target for Webb's allies and supporters. "Will my testimony make a difference?" she asked. "It will put him away for life," Chung replied. "And it will expose the network of officers who have been covering up war crimes for personal advancement. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe, but it will be justice." Sarah looked at Jake. This man who had been a stranger 6 hours ago, but who had been willing to risk everything to help her fight for what was right. She saw in his eyes the same determination that had driven her to refuse illegal orders 3 years ago. The same commitment to principle that had cost her everything and was now giving her a chance to reclaim it. "Ghost 9 died 3 years ago," Sarah said finally. "But Sarah Chun has a story to tell." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to clear, and the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the Portland skyline. It was the beginning of a new day, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah faced it without looking over her shoulder for enemies who would never stop hunting her. The Ghost was finally free to fly again,